thank you all for being here tonight. It's great to see everybody and meet new friends and old friends. It's great. This is the final event of our 2019 Global Citizens Club event series, which was addressing sort of greening our infrastructure. We started off with the climate mobilization event we did in February. We did a designing transportation event, and then we talked about housing and addressing affordable housing, and so now we're going to be talking about our offshore oil platforms, and is there something we can do with them to repurpose, the pounding swords into plowshares kind of idea, or does it make more sense to just remove them? We're very excited about this event, and coincidentally, this is only the first event during the month where this topic is going to be coming up. And heads up for 2020, our Global Citizens events, we will do these quarterly. We'll be all focused on the hydrogen economy, and we're very excited about that. And we're developing those programs, but just keep that in mind for next year. And then I would like to introduce Ronaldo Brudico, who is president of the World Business Academy, very interesting person who is here to be our moderator, and he'll introduce the topic tonight, and someone I'm honored to work with on a day-to-day basis. So come on up. Yeah.
Hi. So there's one thing that's a little awkward tonight, which I'm going to start off by sharing with you at the beginning, and then we can get it out of the way. There's a significant difference of opinion among certain environmentalists in Santa Barbara County with regard to these offshore platforms. And what we try to do with these panel discussions where we're putting public issues in front of people, we do our best to get both sides of the conversation in the room. And we tried really hard to do that, and we failed this particular time because the EDC, Environmental Defense Center, did not want to participate. So I'm sorry they think that, particularly given, I think it's tomorrow, there's going to be a hearing in Goleta by the State's Lands Commission, I believe, tomorrow. And so clearly there's a public conversation already happening. And the public needs to be involved in that conversation. So I urge you to consider going to the Goleta hearing. I thank you all for coming this evening. I will briefly state what I believe to be the EDC's position that Linda Kropp's taken, and that is that the oil derricks are there. They are required by law to be taken down and removed, and the seabed returned to its original condition as a condition of their having been granted the lease to drill. And there's an estimate that that's about a $1.5 billion expense, which it could be higher actually. And the position of EDC is basically the heck with them. It's the oil companies, make them tear them down and take them away, and let them pay them $1.5 billion and get rid of it. Now, all the oil companies have already on their balance sheets reserved the liability, so it's not like it's going to cause them a hiccup in their future earnings. But the idea that they just, well, heck with them, make them take them down, they agreed to do it, tear them out and get rid of them, is one point of view. There's a very significant, and by my independent assessment of the environmental community in Santa Barbara, I would say by far the majority view is we probably should do something more intelligent with them. That if in fact they're there, we wouldn't have put them there in the first place, but what can we do to repurpose them became the question. Some people asked me tonight as we were starting, have you thought about the idea of using the electricity that could be generated from the ocean to use reverse osmosis and pump fresh water to places like Santa Barbara and Montecito, for example. And that's something that could be discussed. You'll see these this picture here, and there's a larger one in the back of the room talking about a proposal for Platform Holly, which is the subject of tomorrow's meeting in Goleta, suggesting that there should be a conversion to offshore electricity generation generally, that would be a good repurposing. So there are other points of view. I really wish that EDC had chosen to come and to fully articulate their position, because I cannot make more of it than that their desire is to take them down and force the oil companies to eat it, basically. And although I'm not a person who has a great deal of love lost for the oil companies, I'm not also somebody who likes to cut off my nose to spite my face. So if we've got an asset out there in the channel, if it can be repurposed to something really useful to our community, whether that's fisheries, as you'll be hearing about later, because each one is a miniature reef, whether it's a source of offshore electricity, whether it's a source of some other scientific or domestic pursuit, if it can be done and the oil companies paid for it, I say we should explore the question. We're not taking a position tonight, we're exploring the question. So with that, I wanted to just thank Seth Blackman for coming tonight. Seth is the attorney who is representing the State Lands Commission, and I think that Jennifer Lucchese is here somewhere in the crowd. Maybe yes, maybe not. Oh, there she is. Jennifer's with us, and she's the executive officer of the State Lands Commission. So with that, and the other people who are here from, we call them dignitaries, Eric Friedman is here. I saw him earlier tonight, Santa Barbara City Councilman. There's Eric. Viviana Morales is here from Monique Lamone's office, I think. Yes, there she is. Thank you for coming. And Wendy Mota from the Office of Salud Carbajal is here. So thank you very much for coming. So our elected officials at least are listening as well as we are to this conversation. And as like all these conversations we have, it's really about you out there helping us figure out what we as a society, as a civis, as a population that's committed to these issues, what do we think and how would we like to steer the outcome? So with that, and without any further ado, I think the best person to introduce first would be Claire. Claire Gonzalez is and you have a little program guide, so I'm not going to do extensive bio reading, but Claire is a marine ecologist, a conservationist, a PADI dive master, so am I. And, not a dive master, I'm just a PADI guy. And has a extensive background in marine biology. So without further ado, I'm going to just ask Claire to give us a few thoughts. Please, Claire.
Is this the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Hi, everyone. So first off, I'd just like to thank you all for taking time out of your week and coming to this talk tonight. These discussions are super important in conserving California's offshore natural resources, so thank you all for being here. My name is Claire Gonzalez, and I'm a marine scientist and an officer on the board of directors of the Blue Latitudes Foundation. The Blue Latitudes Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to elevate the traditional concept of ocean stewardship in a way that integrates industry, government, and the environment. One of our initiatives at the Blue Latitudes Foundation is Riggs to Reef and its potential application in California. So that's why I'm here to be able to join in this discussion and talk with you all about the future of California's offshore oil platforms. All right, this is how people generally envision offshore oil platforms. Towering steel structures, blemishes on the environment, and a looming potential for oil spills, as well as a constant reminder of our insatiable reliance on fossil fuels. However, how many people have seen an oil rig from underwater? Okay, awesome. That's more than the normal amount of hands we get for that question, so you all are doing great already. Just beneath the surface, these structures foster a really complex and beautiful ecosystem. Sponges and corals are wrapped around every beam and cross beam, and countless fish make their homes here. I think Milton Love can maybe give us a little bit more description on that a little bit later. Rockfish, Bocaccio, and even the California state fish, the Garibaldi, all live on California's offshore platforms. So, what happens when we need to remove these structures? Thanks. Well, that's why we're all here today, and one structure specifically is facing that fate right now. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is Platform Holly. It's an oil platform just a couple miles off of Goleta. Platform Holly was owned by a company named Veneco until 2017 when Veneco went bankrupt. So at that point, Holly was transferred over to the state of California, to the California State Lands Commission, and all operation was ceased. So now the responsibility of decommissioning Platform Holly has fallen to California. And that's something that's happening right now, which is another great reason that we're all in the same room talking about this. This is also important because California hasn't decommissioned anything in over 30 years. The last time we pulled a rig out of the water was 1988, and since then our policies have changed. And this is one of the things that has changed. This is an assembly bill It was passed by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2010, and it's known as the Marine Resources Legacy Act. Essentially, what the Marine Resources Legacy Act does is it established the California Artificial Reef Program, and it allows California to partially decommission, which basically means that through the decommissioning process, you can leave a portion of the structure in the water to continue to live on as an artificial reef. That being said, there are a few things that need to be amended in this law, and so California hasn't utilized it yet, and before we really do utilize it, we would need to address those necessary amendments. But more broadly speaking, this conversation is more than just about Platform Holly. California has 27 offshore oil platforms along its coast, and eventually all of them are going to need to come out. So what policymakers and regulators and us as citizen stakeholders choose to do now is going to impact the California coast for years and years to come. So that's why we're all here. I'm super grateful that everyone came out to have this discussion. I can provide a little bit of background on rigs to reef and potential sustainable decommissioning options in California, and we can see what we can do to preserve California's natural resources. Thanks.
So, as Claire said, she's with the nonprofit Blue Latitude, and they've been really doing a tremendous amount of data accumulation. So when she speaks to these issues, she's actually doing us a favor using all those English words, because I know you do a lot of data accumulation. And I think that's really important, because if any of you in the question period want to know more about some of the data behind what these reefs stand for, how they're used, et cetera, what the choices are, I think that Blue Latitudes has a good background in it. The next speaker that we'd like to bring to the front is, I guess, Seth. It'd be great if you could come next, because Seth is the attorney representing the Lands Commission, and with Holly, now, and just a quick footnote, Platform Holly is unlike the other platforms we're talking about tonight. Holly is in a separate jurisdiction in effect, right? So it's the only one that is not in the same clump as the 6 down here. So if you could explain to people the difference. But because of that, as well as because of the Veneco bankruptcy, Holly is the first through this process and has some unique aspects. But for the most part, what we choose to do with Holly might very well set the tone for what we do with the rest of them. And as you just heard, there's 27 to go. So with no further ado, Seth, if you could.
Hey folks, how's everyone doing tonight? Good. So we've got a lot we can talk about. I need to first give the caveat as a state worker, any opinions expressed are my own and not necessarily of my commission. For the most part, I'm going to try and kind of give you all the insight as to what we would do on the state side as we work through the plug and abandonment program into the decommissioning of a platform like Platform Holly. One thing I think that's important, and I'll just get to this right away with what Ronaldo had asked about, is there are a total of 27 platforms offshore California. 4 of those platforms are in state waters. 23 of those are in the federal OCS. So as a general rule, the role that the State Lands Commission has is plenary authority over the 4 platforms in state waters, subject to a whole series of statutory frameworks and leasing frameworks that go along with that. As it relates to the other 23 platforms that are in federal waters, it's a whole different issue. And I think much to Claire's point earlier, a lot of that has to do with what happens down the road on potential rigs to reefs issues. And I'm not going to speak to that as a positive or a negative, but there are limitations on what current federal operators are willing to engage in based on limitations in the existing rigs to reefs bill. And that's because of liability issues. So this is a recent picture of Platform Holly. Just for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, as Claire mentioned, in 2017, Veneco, the company that was operating Platform Holly, went bankrupt and they walked off the site. State Lands Commission stepped in. We brought in operators to maintain the site so that we didn't have problems with like an oil spill or anything else. One of the problems that we're engaged in right now is called plug and abandonment. We have 30 wells on Platform Holly that are open. They're open to production capabilities, so we have to close them. That's what we call plug and abandonment. That's the first thing you do before you can begin even discussing decommissioning and whatever may come in the future as it relates to the platform. What's interesting here is that this picture is very recent, and it doesn't look any different for a lot of people, but the entire top deck has been completely repurposed because the old operations had been so degraded. So we actually had to rebuild parts of the platform so that we can plug and abandon and ultimately decommission it. And the other thing that I think is really interesting on Platform Holly, unlike any of the other three platforms in state water, is Holly is anchored the deepest. It's in 211 feet of water. Everything else is in much lower, 60 feet or less. So there are differences in terms of sort of the ecosystem that attaches to the subsurface that Milton Love and others can talk about here. And I have some video just to show you actual video of Holly based on a recent dive. So as I noted here, this is Frank Kinnaman. He works with UCSB on a hydrocarbon study with Dr. Valentine. If you can scroll to 40 seconds, that's where they start to go underwater. And it's a good video, nice high definition GoPro video that, for those of you who have never dived under, give you a great view of what we're talking about. All of those kind of orange pieces or casings, those go external to each well, so there are 30 casings. It's a secondary containment. This is the actual jacket of the platform that they're getting ready to go down, completely colonized with various bivalves, and you'll see all kinds of different echinoderms and other things like that on here. So this is interesting. One of the other things you may notice is all the bubbles. Those are not bubbles from the breathing apparatus. That is actually the natural seeps that underlie Platform Holly and behind them. So that is gas, that is seep gas. Every once in a while, you may see a small, slightly darker colored bubble coming up, but it's oil, and it's just constantly percolating. So this, I'm just gonna let run, watch it. But the idea behind all of this for the purposes of the platform is there is a lot. I mean, regularly these platforms have to be cleaned, and the biomass has to be scraped off down to a certain level to ensure that, that the structural integrity of the platform can be assessed. Below that level, they allow the growth to continue. And so in this particular case, you have a very unique operation like you do on the 23 platforms offshore in the federal OCS of having a vertical column that runs just shy of 200 feet down to the water's floor, or to the sea floor, which allows for this really unprecedented sort of growth in terms of the ecosystems and the different kind of clines that are associated with the different levels in the water. So this is just sort of fascinating, and I think it's a very beautiful example of what's there just in terms of this one particular platform. This platform also is not huge in comparison to the other federal platforms. They're physically larger, meaning that the biomass associated with the development on the platform is greater. So again, very interesting kind of background information. The biggest question, I think, for today's topic is everybody wants to know what to do with the platform, and we don't have a position on that. The Commission's position is that under the lease and under the laws that the state has created, the Commission's expectation is that we can compel the full removal and site restoration, but that there's also flexibility to assess whether or not that's the appropriate determination. And that's something that is going to be entirely driven by a lot, quite frankly, public interaction. When the Commission begins the physical decommissioning process, we will be doing it through the kickoff of a California Environmental Quality Act EIR, Environmental Impact Report. And that's going to be important because when we do the environmental impact report, we'll have a scoping meeting, kind of like what we would have here. Everyone would be invited. We would be taking ideas from everyone, so ideas about what types of alternatives may be available. Those would be assessed through the process in CEQA, through full public review and our review internally to look at what's feasible, what's technically feasible, what's not, what has environmental benefits, what are the environmental pros and cons. After which point, once we've gone through the process of fully scoping out the entire EIR, we go through and do all the analysis. We look at, like I said, the pros and cons for every major alternative that gets carried through on the EIR. That final document will then go to our commissioners, and our commissioners will be looking at the comments that folks have sent in and the comments that folks are making in real time during that CEQA determination to determine what alternative they believe is in the best interests of the state. At which point they can make a decision and the commission can follow through, the commission staff and contractors will follow through on whatever that decision may be. If it's full removal and site restoration, that's what we do. If it is a partial removal with some sort of reefing option, that's something we can do. One of the unique things here that's a little different from the federal platforms is that the commission, as the plenary authority over the sovereign lands that these platforms sit on, does have the ability to do something akin to a reefing option. It is not limited by the rigs to reefs legislation. And so it does allow us to really take in the full panoply of potential public comment and ideas. And whether it is something like turning it into a wind farm or working on some other wave energy program, these are all options we can look into and assess. And the commission would then have the opportunity of having the benefit of all the wisdom of the public and their thought process on this, and really assessing what the needs for the state are. The next picture is a little overfly of Rincon Island. This is a little farther south from you guys. This is down Ventura County area. But this is the other decommissioning project that the State Lands Commission is working on. This one's interesting. It's a man-made island out in the middle of the water. It's about 2,700 feet offshore. And the interesting part about this is that particular island is built with these rocky tetrahedrons in a very unique area that has created basically anchor points for kelp and for other marine biota. It's actually one of the top lobster spots in California, largely probably because of the protective elements that are created by the island. Again, much like with Platform Holly, this is going to go through the same kind of CEQA treatment, the same environmental impact report assessment, because the commission has to assess whether or not full removal and site restoration is actually in the best interests, or whether some modification or modified use is a better opportunity. So while I won't weigh in on telling you what the best option is, because I don't know. I mean, we are really looking for sort of this collaborative interaction between the public and our commissioners and the commission staff. I do understand there is a huge spectrum of possible alternatives, and we're looking forward to exploring them with you. So,
Seth, give me a sense of the timetable for the commission
Sure.
on Holly, because that's right up for a decision.
It is. So, well, actually, it's a little bit reversed on that. So, Rincon Island, we're about 47 out of about 80 wells plugged and abandoned. We have just kicked off the full plug and abandonment of Platform Holly. Platform Holly will be conservatively 3 years of plug and abandonment. The part and parcel with that relative to Rincon is that there will be an overlap where we'll start the EIR process prior to the completion of plug and abandonment, so that when we are ready to start the decommissioning process, the physical removal or modification of the infrastructure, that will all be done in advance. So we'll have gone through the process of that to inform the commission and inform the public of what direction we may go. So there is still some time. The commission's, I will say that the commission's decommissioning of Platform Holly will be ahead of the federal platforms, just because of where we are on these things, and some of the other federal platforms are larger. The other two Vinico-owned platforms were Gale and Grace. They're in federal waters. Chevron is responsible for removing those at this point, and they are actually planning on doing a full removal of those platforms because there isn't a viable rigs to reefs option for them. And so for liability purposes, they need to get rid of it. And it is one of the big questions that we're going to grapple with at the commission as well. And my job as an attorney is to assess if we are going to keep a platform out there, not in a production setting. The oil and gas aspect of that is gone, right? It's just, you have this giant superstructure that's in 211 feet of water that has to be maintained. And who's going to do that? Who's going to maintain it? Who's going to take liability for it? Should the state ultimately take liability for it if it collapses and somebody gets hurt or there's some other issue? So that's one of the things we have to grapple with as far as what's available. If there is a great modified use that allows a productive economic life out of the platform and kind of ticks all the boxes, and we can find a way to basically shift that liability from us as taxpayers together to an operator or a corporation that wants to operate out there, that's great. Or if the public as a whole says we want to take that liability on because we see other benefits to it, again, that's the kind of thing that we can take into account through the commission and through our ongoing kind of public outreach.
Explain to the commissioner's office.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Our commission is made up of 3 individuals. It is the Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis, the Controller, Betty Yee, and the Director of Finance. And directors, I'm drawing a blank real quick. Keely Bosler, thank you. So we have 2 elected officials and an appointed official with in the direct chain of command with the Governor of California. So that is our administrative body for this. And again, when this all starts up, the commission is very responsive to community input. And I think that's important to the extent that you have a view or a vision for where things should go. We need to know, and you need to not be shy about it, and you need to come to us and kind of help us build out what you see as a potential vision so that we can take that through and evaluate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, one thing I wanted to take away from that timeline, you're talking years for this to all happen. I think Seth's point was 3 years just to do the plug on Holly, the plugs. All of these wells will be plugged either way. In other words, there's no remaining oil coming, well, hopefully, out of any of the wells if we do it properly. The other thing that's important is because the commission is dominated by elected officials, the people who will be sitting on the commission when this decision is made probably aren't there right now, meaning they will be new people elected to those offices when those votes come down. But what will be there is the record that the staff's accumulating now. And that's why this is such an important public conversation, because it actually is, we're setting the tone not just for Holly and for the four others that'll come and Rincon, but we're also talking about the full 27 in the state of California. And whatever the State Lands Commission chooses to do on Holly will be probative at the very least and possibly persuasive for the disposition of all of them. So this is really an important conversation, massive assets involved, and a lot of public input's really being encouraged. And I urge you to, it's a really important thing for you as citizens to go, you know, I want to put my 2 cents in there. And there's lots of time to do that. There's no urgency, but the process has started. They're plugging those wells in. They're accumulating the public comments now. So please start thinking about it. With that, I'd like to next introduce our own Dr. Milton Love from UCSB, a very distinguished marine biologist. That's Milton. He apparently watches Stephen Colbert. He does it the same way. Milton, you got to come up here, though. You got to talk from here because we got the camera. And all these events are videoed and audioed, and we do that so that people who can't come at night can get a copy if they need to see it. So, Milton, with no further ado, please.
So what I'm going to do in the next 8 minutes, apparently, is discuss the results of over 20 years of research that my lab and I have done on the role that platforms in California play as fish habitat. Normally that takes me like an hour and a half. So this is like a scene from hell for me. So basically what you're going to get are some pretty pictures and some overarching statements that are going to be unsatisfying for all of us. So if you have questions, you can come to my lab, you can email me, I'll send you papers, I'll show you the real PowerPoint, like that. What I'm not going to do tonight is give you the kind of the truth about the best decommissioning option, because that's not my job. My job is to give you facts. And I give the same facts to everybody, and because you're all human, you can ignore the facts, you can twist the facts to your philosophy, whatever you want to do. You paid for it. Most of this research came from federal dollars, so I just give the same facts to everybody. And the reason that I can't tell you what is the best decommissioning option is that's not a biological question. That's a philosophical question. And Ronaldo's kind of begun to address that. So for instance, there are, in some cases, some years, at some platforms, hundreds of thousands of fish. Not every year and not every platform, but there are always millions of animals living on the jacket, on the superstructure. There's all these invertebrates, mussels and crabs and anemones, all these things. And if you remove a platform, which is one decommissioning option, you kill them all. So some people go like, well, that's a terrible thing. But if you, as Ronaldo has intimated, if your highest belief is that the oil industry signed a contract saying they would remove the platforms when they're not economical to operate, then that's the most important thing to you. The sea life is of lesser importance. There are people who feel that anything artificial in the ocean is not good. Well, platforms are artificial. And what they want is they want the mud back. There was mud there before there was a platform. And there was a lot of animals living in the mud. They're not there anymore. They want the mud back. And that's not right or wrong. That's just a philosophy. And whatever I have found regarding marine life is of lesser importance. Now, the opposite side of the coin is there are people who go like, well, these seem to be fully functioning reefs, and they are. That's what's important to me. Well, okay, that's neither right or wrong. It's neither better or worse than any other philosophy. It's just theirs. And for those people, what I have found, what the people in my lab have found, that would be important. But you can see that I'm not going to stand up here and go like, well, one option is better than another. And by the way, the options, there are all kinds of options for decommissioning, but they tend to fall into three categories. One is you completely remove the platform and the underlying shell mount. That's kind of the default. Second one is you cut the platform below the surface at some level. And off California, we tend to talk about maybe 80 or 100 feet below the sea surface. Or you can leave them in place. That option is discussed less. It's not impossible, of course, but it's not discussed as much as, for instance, cutting them below the sea surface. So now, having said that, I think in the interest of transparency, I should tell you my own view, because I get to have one as a citizen, not as a biologist, but as a citizen. And my view is there are millions of animals that live on every platform. If you remove the platform, you kill them all. And I think that's an immoral view. That's an immoral thing to do. But that's just my view as a citizen, and hopefully it doesn't impinge on my research efforts. I just feel like I have to kind of explain where I'm coming from. So very quickly, if we could, oh yeah, okay. Hard to see. So there are the funders. Most of the funding, maybe 90% of the funding since '95 has come from the federal government. It came from the National Biological Survey, it came from the U.S. Geological Survey, it came from the Minerals Management Service. And then a small amount is laundered money from the oil industry. It came from the California Artificial Reef Enhancement Project, which is an NGO completely funded by Chevron. So a small amount of all the money I've gotten has been cleaned, it's been laundered. And I actually picked the money up in gold bars in a Bolivian airport. And so no one knows. Well, now they know. Now you know. So that's where it comes. And the reason I always bring it up is that at least one person in this town has, over the years, said bad things about me because this person claims that I'm kind of the shill for the oil industry because a little of my funding has come from the oil industry, and let's just call it 10%. So my response always has been, well, if 10% of my data is a lie, that's not bad. That's pretty good. It's a pretty good percentage, really. So I actually got a call years ago from my accountant in LA, and he said, there's somebody saying bad things about you on television. I said, well, that's this person's job to undermine my credibility. So anyway, there you go. So that's the reason I bring up who funded this. So now we'll just look at some pretty pictures. There's a typical platform. All platforms in California basically, other than one platform, basically look the same underwater. All platforms are made out of steel, and most platforms look rather simple underwater. They have vertical pilings, and they're cylindrical. They have cylindrical crossbeams, and then they have a whole series of crossbeams that run inside, and then they have a whole series of conductor pipes. That's where the oil and gas comes through, which are also these cylindrical pipes. So they're all very standard, except for one platform, Eureka off Long Beach, which is more complex underwater and actually has more marine life because it is more complex. Next. So initially we were tasked with, back in '95, what fishes live around platforms and over nearby natural reefs, and that's really important. You can't just look at a platform and go like, hey, here's what we found. You have to have a frame of reference. What do the natural reefs look like? So that was one, and the next one, next slide. And that's the big question for every artificial reef is, if you're looking at fishes around a platform or other artificial reef, are the fishes being produced by the platform? That is, are there more fishes in Southern California because the platform is there, or are they just aggregating fish? Are they luring fish in from natural reefs? Well, if that's the case, then the platforms aren't enhancing anything, they're just redistributing what's already there. So that was the kind of the two main questions that we've looked at over the years. Next. There you go, there's the kind of the intertidal zone, there's a heavy mussel layer. The mussel layer extends down 30 or 60 feet on all the platforms off California. And the next slide. There's kind of a close-up. The jacket, the steel structure is covered in mussels. Hundreds of thousands, millions and millions of mussels. And then all of the animals that associate with the mussels. So you get club anemones that are attached, all kinds of anemones, crabs walking around. Used to be a lot of sea stars. Sea stars all up and down the Pacific coast got this virus, and they just melted away, and they're slowly coming back, or not, depending on who you believe. But there's still some sea stars there. Next. All kinds of anemones, that's Metridium, the white ones. Next. And then when you go down 60, 80, 100 feet, you start running out of mussels and you get into other invertebrates. We're just talking invertebrates now. And that happens on natural reefs. There's a succession as you go into deeper and deeper waters. So this is the bottom of platform Gale, about 700 feet of water. So by that time, you're way out of mussels. So now you get king crabs, there's a king crab there, you get gigantic Metridiums, those white anemones, they're sponges, they're deep water corals. They don't look like tropical corals, these are different, but they're corals nonetheless. And they're found in cold water, so these are cold water corals. Next. And then around all platforms, there is some form of shell mount. As was alluded to, I think Claire alluded to it, the platforms are cleaned, usually down to 30 or 60 feet. They're cleaned by divers of the overburden of invertebrates, and all of those fall to the bottom. Now, if you're in relatively shallow water, 200 feet, like Seth was mentioning at Holly, or Grace in 400 and something feet, those all fall kind of straight down, and you get these very thick shell mounds that are 8, 10, or more feet thick of shells, and they may extend out a couple hectares. If you're in really deep water, like Hondo up above, or like in Las Flores area, or the ones that are up above Conception, Hermosa, then as the shells fall, they get carried out by currents. So you don't get this thick layer, but you get scattered shells all over the place. And this habitat is unique to the area around platforms. There is no habitat like this, certainly anywhere in California, and maybe not in most of the world. And there's a whole group of invertebrates that occupy those shells exclusively. They tend to be nursery grounds. These are little crabs that are about the size of a $50. Next. And lots of sea stars, at least before they all melted away. Next. Spot prawns. I mean, there's some economically important invertebrates. Next. So that's the invertebrates. We didn't focus most of our research on invertebrates, a little bit, but not much. But then we focused primarily on fishes. The top 100 feet, we meaning the people in my lab, I'm just kind of the pretty face. Everybody else does the heavy lifting. We have scuba divers who survey fishes down to 100 feet, and then we use that little 2-person submarine for going down to the bottom, and the deepest platform is in 1,200 feet. And so we use the sub to look at 100 feet down to 1,200, depending on the platform. Next. And then all of those submersible surveys, we have a video camera that videotapes everything. We voice over it. Those 2 tubes there are ruby lasers. So when we look out the port of the sub, there are 2 red dots, and that gives us an idea of what 20 centimeters are. So we can not only identify all the fish we see as we go along the platform, we can make an estimate of their length. Next. That kind of gives you a schematic of what we do. We go down the bottom. We go out maybe 20 feet, and we go all the way around the platform and count the fishes on the shell mound. We go into just on the outside of the platform, at the bottom, go all the way around, and then we go up every cross beam. And those cross beams are maybe 40 meters apart, 30 meters apart, and we go as high up as we can until the current gets too bad. And that's how we survey the fishes. Next. I'll show that's an image of where all the platforms are. Everything that has a star, we have surveyed. The green dots are platforms that either are too shallow for us or too far south. And basically, every platform now has been surveyed for fishes by somebody. at least once, and in our case, sometimes 15 or 20 or even more times. Next. And this also shows you all the places in California, Southern California, where we've taken the sub and surveyed on natural reefs. So we've basically done surveys all the way out to the edge of the continental shelf before you just drop off into the abyss. And the take-home message is that all natural reefs have been heavily fished. Some less and some more, but you could go out 120 miles before you drop off, and most of the fish there are less than 1.5 feet long because there's been a century of recreational fishing, millions of people recreational fishing, and commercial fishing both. So heavily overfished areas. Next. That's a take-home message as far as fishes are concerned. Not all platforms are created equal, and in fact, every platform is slightly different. There are similarities, but there are also differences. Next. But if you held a gun to my head and said you have to make a series of generalities, okay, here's what we would say. First of all, there's a group of fishes that are kind of semi-pelagic. They swim in a big school, and they take a look around, and then they leave, and the platforms have no influence on whether, where they are or why they're there. So jack mackerel, Pacific mackerel, bonita, anchovies, things like that. You go down one day and you see a whole bunch like there, you come back the next day and they're gone because it's just not, it's not their habitat. Next. And then in the shallowest parts of platforms, you see all the typical reef fish that you would see on a natural reef. These are Garibaldi, for instance, higher densities of Garibaldi than you would normally see on a platform, but typical species. Next. Sheephead, same kind of thing, very typical species of nearshore natural reefs. Next. This is the big difference. So these are all juvenile rockfishes. Rockfishes are the dominant group of fishes on the Pacific coast. Every marine habitat has at least one species, and some may have 15 or 20 species, big economically important group of fishes. The biggest difference between platforms and natural reefs is that platforms tend to be better, I shouldn't say that, they tend to have higher densities of young rockfishes than do typical natural reefs. And that's not because platforms have been sprinkled by pixie dust or magical places where everybody plays the lute and sings songs. They could be that, but we never saw anybody do that. So if you give me some money, I'll test that hypothesis out. So anyway, there's actually a very good biological reason. And that is that most of these very young rockfishes drift around in the plankton when they're like 1/4 of an inch long. And at some point they want to settle out. They want to settle out on something hard, and they don't care what it is. They don't care if it's a rock, if it's a sewer pipe, if it's a tire, or if it's a platform. And they're about, on average, 50 feet, 80 feet below the surface. And they're much more likely to encounter a platform, which covers the entire water column, than a reef, which may be right near the platform, but is like 150, 200, 500 feet down. So it's just the encounter rate is much higher for these young fishes. And that's the reason you almost always have higher densities of these young fishes at a platform than you do at a natural reef. Next. So that's the midwater. There's a community of fishes in midwater, and at the bottom you tend to get bigger fish. So if the midwater tends to be a place where you have young small fish, the bottom is a place where you have older and larger fish. And the reason you tend to get higher densities of larger fish at platforms than at nearby reefs is that platforms act as de facto marine reserves. That is, they weren't set up as marine reserves, but there tends to be less fishing around them than at natural reefs. And part of that is that some platforms sit in the middle of just horrendous weather. The ones above Conception, it's awful. Who's going to go up there and fish? Even if you're a commercial fisherman, it's just not worth it. And part of it is that the oil industry really doesn't like, particularly after 9/11, they don't like random people coming up and boats they don't know, and they'll call the Coast Guard on you if you try to come up and fish next to them. I once asked a guy who worked on Platform Gale if the crew people on the platforms fish, because I really wanted to get a handle on the fishing effort. And he said, this is years ago, he said, well, you know, after you get off a shift, you don't want to fish. All you want is a Dove bar. I went, oh. He said, yeah, and now that Veneco owns Gale, we don't get Dove bars. Huh. Yeah, and I don't like the apples either. And I'm thinking, I'm going, really? He said, yeah, we used to get Fuji's. Now we get Red Delicious. I hate Red Delicious. I'm like, myself, I'm going like, what's my role here? Is this like a labor thing? I can sing labor songs. I can sing with this guy, Joe Hill, probably. And then he went on to other things. But I established there was relatively little fishing anyway on this platform. So platforms generally have larger fishes at the bottom because there's less fishing intensity than around most natural reefs. Thanks. And what that leads to, so these are boccaccio, overfished, federally listed overfished species, probably got down to about 10% of its virgin stock, has been rebuilt. It's no longer overfished. But at one time, when I took this shot back in, 1997, the highest densities of adult boccaccio in Southern California were probably in this one platform Gale. Not that it was magical, but there wasn't much fishing going on. Next. And this is even more intense. This is a cowcod, another economically important fish. That was down to about 3% of its unfished levels. And by far the highest densities we saw was again at platform Gale. I actually have a tattoo on my arm of a cowcod. I really like it. So next. Okay, so that's the bottom of the platform. And then on the shells, our old favorite shell mounds, you get similar fish living on the platform, but they tend to be the younger stages. Or they tend to be fishes that never get very big. So you tend to get these schools of these half-banded rockfish, 10, 15, 20,000 of them swimming around. Next. Or there's a juvenile cowcod that's probably the size of my thumb. So you get the juveniles on the shells, and then when they get old enough, they move over to the platform and we assume live their life as an adult. I don't have proof that they stay there forever, but that's an assumption. Next. Okay, then I'm about to just give you a bunch of airy-fairy overarching statements, but I want to do one more very specific thing. So this is a slide that looks at fish production around platforms and compares it to fish production on other kinds of marine habitats. And really, I was kind of expecting I could stick my finger underneath this, but let me tell you what fish production is, or what production is. Production is a metric that's used all over the world as a way of comparing the value, I hate to say that, but the value of a habitat. And basically, production is composed of two things. How many of a group of things there are, their density, and how fast they're growing, how fast they're putting on carbon, okay? And previous to the study we did at platforms, there was a convention that, well, the highest secondary productivity, fish productivity in the world are found in estuaries. So people said, oh, estuaries, very productive. Or on some coral reefs, very productive, and they are. So when we did the study, and I did not do the study, Jeremy Clace at Cal State Pomona took the data we had looking at the fish populations around platforms, and he did a model, and he showed that every platform that he looked at in California, fish production was higher at every single platform than at any other habitat in the world. Does that mean literally it has the highest productivity anywhere in the world? No, we haven't done every habitat in the world. This was just from published literature. This is all we had. Does that mean that every single year this is true? No, this is only based on the data he has. But the implication is that these platforms, you could argue, based on that study, are quite productive as far as the fishes are concerned, using this metric. Thanks. Okay, so what have we learned since 1995? Okay, we've all seen the humor of it. Next. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to read these to you. In broad terms, there are two fish assemblages around most California platforms. There's one in the midwater and the other around the platform base and the associated shoreline. Next. The water columns within many platforms serve as rockfish nursery grounds and nursery grounds for other species of fish, but rockfish is dominant. Young of the year rockfish, that is juvenile rockfish, densities around many platforms are greater than those at most natural reefs. Now, is this true for every platform? No. If you go to Emmy or Eva, the ones that are off Huntington Beach in 45 feet of water, it's probably not true. There haven't been very many studies, but the ones that have been done by Chris Lowe's students at Long Beach State imply that that's not true. So it's not every single platform, but it's probably true of many platforms. Next. Some platforms act as de facto marine reserves. Is that true for every platform? No. It's probably not true for a couple platforms off Long Beach where sport fishing party boats have been kind of grandfathered in, and they'll come up right next to them, and you'll have 40 people fishing there. So it's probably not true for some platforms, probably true for the majority of platforms. Next. As with natural reefs, platforms both produce and aggregate fishes. Platforms may be regionally important in enhancing fish production. So, population. So, that's the beauty of platforms. They're, in that sense, just like natural reefs. If you told me, you know what, the most important fish to me is the kelp bass. Do platforms help the kelp bass population? I would say, yeah. And that's almost certainly true. If you said to me, well, how about the boccaccio, overfished? Do you think that because platforms are there, the boccaccio population rebounded faster than if the platforms weren't there? I would go like, yep, probably true, because we have a study that showed that. So it depends on what species you're interested in. It depends, again, on kind of your philosophy of all this. Next. On average, okay, so I think this is the last one. On average, fishes around platforms are neither more nor less contaminated than fish from natural reefs. So that's a very valid question. Platforms are not places where they're producing cotton candy, right? Platforms are industrial facilities. There used to be drilling going on. You have to lubricate the bits with drill muds. Drill muds historically, not so much anymore, used to have high levels of barium and cadmium and all kinds of stuff. You've got water that comes up with the oil and gas. In some cases, you actually pour the water into the ocean. Those things have pollutants. So you would expect that it to be possible that fishes around platforms would be more heavily polluted with certain heavy metals, for instance, than the same species further away. So we got money from the Minerals Management Service, collected fish near platforms and away from platforms, sent the fish to a lab in Missouri, and they said, statistically, there wasn't a difference. Now, is that true for all species of fish? I have no idea. We only picked 2 or 3 species. Is it true for every platform? Nope. I have no idea. We only did it for like 6 platform natural area comparisons. But there doesn't seem to be any overt data that would show that these fishes are more polluted than further away. I think that's it. California oil and gas platforms are among the most productive, well, I already said. So that's it. I ran over my 8 minutes, but I'm kind of proud of it.
I'm going to take it from that exposition that the answer to the question you posed at the beginning of your remarks, do reefs aggregate or create new fish habitat? I believe the answer is it does both, but it does definitely create new fish habitat.
For some species.
For some species, yeah, for some. Yeah. Not for all, for some.
Yeah.
And specifically, you mentioned rockfish as a big one.
For at least some rockfish.
Oh, God. Talk about it.
That's the reason we make bad witnesses in jury trials.
I also want to quickly point out that in his remarks, Milton mentioned cutting the platforms down to about 80 feet below sea level. One of the issues that isn't going to get addressed tonight that you just need to know is out there is the safety issue. And the safety issue they're talking about is we have a quite a bit of marine traffic that goes up and down our channel. And we've never had an incident that I know of where a ship has run into a platform. But one of the issues is if you leave the platform up there and then there's not guys drilling for oil there, how do we know that a ship won't run into it at night or something like that? And the answer is it's on every chart. I don't think it's a real issue, but that's one of the reasons why they prefer to talk about knocking them down to 80 feet below the water level. Okay, it's a very minor issue. I think it was a bigger issue when ships didn't have the technology they have today. But that is an issue that's there. Okay. And the option that exists that was alluded to a moment ago to turn these platforms, if they were preserved, into permanent marine reserves. In other words, we could articulate as part of the disposition of these rigs, say, look, it works really well when you don't let the fishermen come and eat all the fish in the nursery. So we could put a 20 or 30 meter or 100 meter or 500 meter zone around each platform, which would be a marine reserve, so that it would continue to incubate and act as a fish nursery. So that hasn't been fully discussed yet. It's just starting to be thought about. But there's no reason why the marine reserve capacity, meaning people don't pull up and fish next to platforms, because you would get the Coast Guard to stop you. And there's all kinds of marine reserves. As you know, we've had meetings here with Cousteau, and he's basically urged for a large marine reserve creation on our coast, and this could be a subset of that larger marine reserve conversation, which we were not going to go into today. Okay, our last speaker is going to be Kim Selko. Now, Kim's also a PhD. Excuse me. But her unique contribution to tonight's conversation is that she represents the fishing industry locally, which, as you've heard, has been a beneficiary, or some believe, of these platforms in terms of the nursery capabilities, rockfish being one of the most commercially viable species that we do fish and sell regularly in our restaurants locally. If you've ever been to Lure or any of our better fish restaurants, you know how common rockfish is on the menu. So without further ado, Kim, could you give us the fish community's assessment of this?
I will, thank you. And Milton, you're a very hard act to follow. No thank you to you. And that was the longest 8 minutes of my life. I promise the next 8 minutes will be about 8 minutes. So I am a marine scientist by background, and I've been affiliated with UCSB for many years, but about 4 years ago now, I took a position as the executive director of our Commercial Fishing Association here in town, Commercial Fishermen of Santa Barbara, which is a 501c3 nonprofit with an educational mission. And I feel very proud to be in that capacity and grateful for it. I've learned so much, and I feel very confident that I can represent our fishing community and advocate for them as a marine scientist and as an environmentalist of sorts, because our fisheries are very sustainable, and our fishermen are always working on ways to make their fisheries more sustainable, working within the regulations, following the rules, and have had to adapt to a lot of changes over the last few years. At the moment, we have about 200 fishermen using our port every year, and we're bringing in about 4 to 7 million pounds of seafood across our docks. Over 100 species are sold commercially from our docks. It's one of the most diverse ports in the country, and that's a real asset to us. Creates resilience as the climate changes and fluctuates. We always have something that's booming. And that amount of catch generates about $11 to $14 million of revenue to the fishermen off the docks, and that then generates about $35 million to our community just in the fishing industry's sort of indirect effects through the seafood industry. And so this is not a small industry, it's an important one, and it creates food security for our community. It creates a very healthy food source with low food miles. And when the Refugio oil spill happened, the seafood industry and the fishing industry was hurt pretty badly. A lot of people thought the entire channel was polluted and would not buy our seafood. The fishermen lost a lot of revenue. They were also excluded from a very large area. And actually that's something that really changed my life, because Plains All-American gave a grant to the Chamber of Commerce in Santa Barbara to create a position that would help to give the fishing industry a little bit of help with the PR and getting people to understand that the seafood is safe here and make up for those losses. And that was me. And so that's what brought me here. So I came with a little bit of oil money. We're being very transparent here today. That funded my first 2 years with the Fishing Association. I had no contact with Plains whatsoever, and it was a one-time thing. And since then, a lot of my funding for my executive director position has come from the Nature Conservancy, so kind of at the other end of the spectrum. And we collaborate on a lot of different research projects to improve fisheries and fisheries management with the Nature Conservancy. And so it's a kind of, there's no kind of straight black and white situation, and that's the case for the oil rigs with our fishing community as well. They're a mixed bag, and I'm going to start with many of the negatives that they've created for our fishing community, namely that they've taken away fishing grounds. For our net fishermen, they have to give those rigs a huge berth so that they don't risk tangling their nets on the rigs up to 2 miles or more. They have to avoid, and that a lot of those rigs are in prime fishing grounds, and they've lost that area with no mitigation money, as is often done in other cases. These rigs can be extremely dangerous if you do end up catching your net on them. They can sink your boat if you're going at a good clip. And they also have negatives because of the perception that oil is being coming out of our channel with a lot of contaminants, and people worry about the contamination of the seafood. We've heard from Milton that there's no evidence that that has a net effect on our seafood, which is good. They've also provided these fishery enhancements, perhaps, to some of our species, but perhaps for some of them they've been aggregators into places where we can't reach those fish. So that sort of cancels each other out, and it's not really clear. No one's studied that in great enough depth from a fisheries perspective to really know the answer there. But they've had some positive effects in terms of being economic opportunities. For many years, there was an aquaculture, or not an aquaculture, sorry, a mussel harvesting operation called Ecomar that was harvesting mussels off of our rigs. There are many beautiful mussels and scallops down there that grow quite large. There's interest in trying to do that again. Recently, one of the oil companies was cleaning the jacket, scraping everything off, and it was a real shame that all of that just sank to the seafloor, even though there's a lot of really economically viable and healthy seafood that could have been taken off of there. Now, the federal government has no way, or kind of no pathway to establish the testing of that shellfish to make sure it's safe for human consumption at this moment, but that's something that can be changed, and we've talked to Blue Latitudes about that. That's a possibility in the future of sustainable shellfish harvest off of these rigs with sufficient testing to make sure they're safe for human consumption. And so there's other economic opportunities as well that these structures present to aquaculture opportunities with potentially growing seaweeds and abalone, for instance, which is a high-value species that could grow quite well out there. Urchin ranching. Right now, our urchin fishery is in decline because of the warm water and the lack of kelp and the abundance of purple urchin, creating these urchin barrens across the reefs. And the red urchin is the fisheries species. And that is because the red urchin has larger gonads, more eggs to make a product out of than the purple urchin. But if you gathered up all those urchin, put them in a big bag, and you hung them off somewhere, like an oil rig or some other structure out in a high flow area, gave them some kelp, you could fatten them up, and you could bring them to market. And that's something that's already started and is also a potential component of kelp forest restoration, to bring all of these purple urchins off the reef, let the kelp regrow, and if we have an economically viable market for these purple urchin, that would create an economic opportunity instead of just a restoration conservation project. So these are some of the things that have been tossed around by our fishing community. The fishermen in our port don't all agree on what should be done with these rigs. There's some that are very set on full removal, return to full access to fishing grounds with full removal of the shell mounds and other potentially contaminated soils. And there are some that feel that keeping them in the water with the actual platform intact would be the best option, because you have that economic opportunity and they're already there and they see kind of a broader picture. Now, the idea of cutting them off at 80 to 100 feet under the water is the least popular with the fishermen because they really do present hazards to fishing. Even though there's, of course, the plan to attach buoys and moorings to these things so that you see them out there, they're not always easy to see, and these moorings can break loose. There's a history of that happening in other decommissioned platforms that still have material in the water, and that becomes a real hazard to fishing boats. And so the guys who are trawling and using nets around these rigs, by and large, that I've talked to, really would prefer that they come completely out or we leave some sort of platform there. Now, every rig is different, and some areas are not in high fishing areas, and so what we feel is it really is a case-by-case determination of what we can do with each rig that makes sense and balances out for everyone's needs, including the fishing industry. And I would mention something that hasn't come up from the panel yet, which is that there's a potential huge cost savings of hundreds of millions of dollars that the oil companies will save if they leave these structures partially in the water. And that has been talked about in terms of creating a fund that the state of California would receive at least 50% of that cost savings or maybe more. And that's a lot of money. It could be up to $500 million. And as citizens of Santa Barbara that have kind of had to deal with the pros and cons of these oil rigs for so many years, it makes sense to me that we would try to make sure some of that money, if that fund were to be set up and there was some savings from this Rigs to Reef program, that we would try to get that money back to our community. We could work on sea level rise adaptation, other climate change adaptation with that money. It seems fairly appropriate. But also other places in California that need this. Our coastal communities definitely need more funding to maintain our port infrastructure. Our fisheries are very productive and are sustainable, and yet they're not really getting the economic attention that they need from the state, the budgets. And we would hope that given that fishermen have been the ones suffering the most from lost fishing grounds, that would be a beneficiary. But I have colleagues who think that that's unrealistic and that the state would distribute these funds in other ways and we wouldn't see much of that money. But I think that, you know, instead of kind of giving up in defeat already, that would be something we'd be interested in working on. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we ended with Kim because we wanted you to hear that even in the fishing community, there is a split of opinion. So two comments. One was the one I just made about the fishing industry itself has a certain split of distinctions. I also want to comment that most of the countries in the world today are starting to look at, in a more serious way than we are, the question of the ocean health. There's countries like Chile, for example, that are talking about doing massive kelp reforestation as a commercial entity and as a way to bring health back to the oceans. So the question of what to do with reefs and rigs and what to do with decommissioned platforms is a bigger question because it's nested inside of this question of we have this incredible channel, the Santa Barbara Channel, and we haven't done as good a job as we need to thinking about how to preserve it and make it healthier. So I just wanted that's the bigger context of this conversation. You'll notice on your little programs that prominently featured on the front and on the back is Solutions News. So part of why we're doing this is this is part of our radio show we do on 1290 AM, local KZSB, and we do it every Friday from 5 to 6 p.m. drive time. We actually take interviewed questions live off the air. And we want you to know that the nature of that show is we always take a challenge, whatever it is, and we will not talk about it on the air unless we can also propose a solution. Because our goal in Solutions News is to have these solutions come forward and for people to realize there's probably more solutions than challenges. We just aren't aware of that because of the constant drumbeat of seeing the challenge itself. 1 second, please raise your hands. How many people here are subscribers to Optimist Daily? Oh, we got a lot of you don't know about this. Okay, so we do a free service called Optimist Daily. It's 5 days a week. It's 5 stories you get in your email, and each one is a happy thought about something good happening somewhere in the world you didn't know about. And it's a way for you to start your day with a smile, because when you get through reading that, which takes about 2 minutes, the depression of the day is about to set in. So go at it with a happy thought, okay? So Optimist Daily is a free service we do for the World Business Academy. We got over 20,000 readers now, growing very quickly, and we'd love to send it to you for free as well. So all you have to do is go to Optimist Daily and sign up for that. Okay, questions. So that was quick. So yes, sir, your name and give the question.
Yes, my name is Gary. Hold on.
Wait for the white microphone's coming. Here is Gary.
Yes, my name is Gary. I'm just curious, knowing nothing about this topic whatsoever, what is the absolute magnitude of the marine life impact of these oil platforms? And by that I mean, just eyeballing it, they appear to take up a very small amount of absolute space in terms of the ocean. And so, does getting rid of them or not getting rid of them have a large or small absolute impact to the reef life?
Are we on? Oh my God. I was looking for ways to switch it on. It's a complex question. I mean, it's an excellent question. I can give you one example where it actually potentially has a profound effect on marine life. So in 2002, we did surveys around 7 platforms in the Santa Barbara Channel. And that particular year was a very, very good year for young rockfishes. Oceanographic conditions were great. And we estimated there was like 430,000 baby boccaccio, just one species. There was all kinds of other things on these 7 platforms. And I thought, wow, that sounds like significant. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was like baby boccaccio everywhere on natural reefs and so forth. So fortunately for me, a lot of people are doing research on natural reefs in that year, and it turned out that there were very few little babies on the natural reefs. So I thought, oh, well, okay, that seems to be important, but is 430,000 a significant figure for that species, juveniles? So I talked to a guy who was at the National Marine Fisheries Service. He was in charge of the assessment of boccaccio for the federal government. And he had a statistical program. And I go like, well, is 430,000 significant? He said, that's probably over half of the baby boccaccio on the entire Pacific coast on an average year. And I said, well, okay, but even that's not all that important if they don't turn into adults. So I said, well, how many adults should that turn into? And this is all like a model, right? We're not God. We don't know the fate of every baby boccaccio. But he said, those fish will raise the population of adults on the entire Pacific coast 1%. So that was, in 1 year, 7 platforms. And to me, that was a significant figure. Now, to answer your question more fully, we ain't never done anything other than that. So you can't tell. For some things, obviously, it's not very important. For other things, it would be.
Yeah, and I would add to that is that if you're going to look at the economic impacts, you want to look at all the other ones as well that we're not talking about tonight, like reverse osmosis water pumped to the shore, electrical generation and pumped to the shore. There's all kinds of different issues. We're just dealing with marine biology tonight. So, but I think that's a great question because they look like little dots on the landscape, and how big a deal is it? From what I can tell, it's a fairly significant one, but I don't have as much information as Milton does. Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add on to that really quickly. Also, with regards to your question, right now we're talking about oil rigs, but California is kind of continuing to utilize the ocean more and more, and I know that off the coast of California, we just sold a bunch of lease blocks for offshore wind, and so yes, the oil rigs make up not that much of hard substrate off of California, but we're going to continue to utilize technology and different industries that go into our ocean, and we need to figure out how to put things in there and take them out sustainably. And so pathways like this still apply.
Thank you for adding that. We had a question from the audience. What is the content of the gas bubbles? I'll tackle that one unless someone else knows. Okay, so we just published a major research paper on June 6th that a lot of those bubbles are methane, actually. And it's a major problem we have because it's rising from hydrates that are releasing methane now in very large quantities. If you want to see that study, it's called the Methane Accelerator. Go to worldbusiness.org and just type in methane accelerator and you'll find the paper, and that'll help to answer that question. How do they, I'm not going to go into how do they plug and abandon the wells. It's a technical answer. We'll happily give it to you privately. And after plugging and abandoning, how does the maintenance change? Well, if they are plugged and abandoned, it doesn't change with regard to the structure itself. Yes, they still have to be maintained and scraped or they'll lose structural integrity. But what it relates to is the seepage, which they'd like to avoid from the oil itself. And last question from the audience, do the platforms collect trash and plastics? Not to the best of my knowledge, but I don't know. Does somebody know that one? No, I haven't heard that is an issue, so I don't think it is. Okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, this is obviously a complex subject.
Your name?
Drew.
Drew.
And so I hope I can be suffer more than one question. One of the things is, it seems like, I don't know, for example, on dismantling the superstructure versus plugging versus dismantling the balance of the structure, I don't know what the cost breakdown is. So, I mean, but it would seem like a shame to give up this legal leverage over the oil industry to extort a significant amount of money for these other more beneficial possibilities. So what I'm getting at is I don't know how much of it's for, and the other thing I'm kind of...
Actually, no one's going to give it up. I mean, even what Kim said, she said she'd hope to get half of the benefit. Our position is we want 100% of the benefit.
Well, and good luck. But I'm just saying, no, but seriously, no, that's fine. But what I'm wondering is, so obviously it would cost them more to take the entire thing away than to take over portions. One of the things I'm curious about is, it's 80 feet below the water line, which obviously is academic, and some of them that aren't even 80 feet deep. Why isn't there any proposal to just go down close to the water line and leave, you know, a remnant of the superstructure? I don't understand why that's not even one of the options.
Sure. I mean, one of the major issues has to do with navigational, yeah, basically.
Right, I understand, but on the same, by the same token, it seems like in a sense, if part of it's visible, it's less of a navigation hazard. Not to mention the fact...
The navigation hazard is a red
I know,
herring.
it's sort of like...
Yeah,
I got
come
it.
on, that's like before round wheels. I mean, we know how to avoid them. No ship has ever run into them.
And there's tons of electronic stuff that people could... Yeah,
I don't think that... The issue's like 80 feet below for other reasons, and I think the question comes up best with what Kim said. One of the problems they have when they cut them down that much is it can snare nets.
Right. So that's why I don't understand why there isn't another plan to not cut them down that much.
Because we just started to have the conversation.
Okay.
That's why we're getting you to talk.
The other thing is, when you were saying that you had to stay, I mean, this sort of, you said under the rules that the fishermen had to stay 2 miles away from them.
Not under rules, just for safety, because the nets can be quite large, and with the current, you know, they get pretty far from the boat. So you can talk to the man in the yellow behind you. He knows all about it.
Okay, but what I'm getting at is, would the fishermen want to stay that far away just for their own benefit?
Yes, they don't want to get any closer than that because it's too dangerous.
Okay.
But they don't want to have to get that far away. They'd like to have as much fishing ground as possible.
But that's because of the technology of like big drag net kind of fishing. I mean, obviously not long line fishing and things like that, but fishing.
No, I mean, even long lines, you wouldn't want your line getting tangled on that thing. It would ruin your day.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's a current-driven issue. Okay, Walt, go ahead. Oh, you do? Go ahead.
Yes. I asked the question about scraping the poles, and if we do leave the platforms and they do need maintenance, is there a way to scrape the poles without killing millions of sea life?
No.
But you can collect them.
You can
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know about the economics, but in theory, you could collect the mussels instead of scraping them and letting them fall. But there's no way of preventing invertebrates from settling on the steel. So eventually, you'd have to do something. So, but it does bring up the question of, well, why don't platforms fall over now? Well, they don't fall over now, they don't rust away now because the industry puts big chunks of zinc on them, and the zinc rusts away preferentially before the steel does. So then the question arose, well, what happens if you never put any more of those zincs on? right? It's now a reef, and no one wants to pay for the zincs. How long would it take before the platform fell over? And apparently, I think this is real. The back of an envelope estimate was something between 300 and 400 years before it actually rusted sufficiently to fall down.
But I do want to make the point that Kim made earlier. So you could harvest them, but we don't currently have a standard for human consumption of harvested mussels and sea life, and that would include every form of shellfish that's on it. So if a crab walks away, no problem, but scallops don't walk away, they're stuck. And so the question is really one of safety. But from what we can tell, there is no human risk eating the fish in that environment. Walt's got a question.
Yeah.
Wait for the, yeah, it's coming.
Yeah. My name is Bob Hazard, and
Bob, I'm sorry.
Associate Editor for the Montecito Journal. And first, I'd really love to applaud you all, the World Business Academy, for putting a session on repurposing on the agenda, because nobody else is doing this. But I see a bad disconnect here. And my problem is, okay, we've talked a lot about repurposing. You've mentioned desalinated water plants to get fresh water for all of the South Coast and get it practically for free. You've mentioned electrical generation of wind farms, and you've mentioned restoring kelp beds. But the disconnect comes in that now what's going to happen is they're going out for public comment to Goleta, Marnite, et cetera, and it's kind of a popularity vote of the community people without a good understanding of all these alternatives. So what's needed is, in my mind, a proof of concept for each of these alternatives. And that means you've got to say, is it technically feasible? How much does it cost? How are we going to fund it? Et cetera. And I don't see anybody doing that. And so there's this big vacant black hole in the middle of information that's not available right now for any of these
This is the
concepts.
first one. So this is a proof of concept for Platform Holly for wind. I'm not endorsing it. I've never read it before tonight, but I'm just pointing out that they exist. I think you're right that most of what we talked about tonight doesn't exist yet. The good news is we're talking about years for this conversation to occur.
Well, yeah, I'd like to jump in because the California Environmental Quality Act process of doing an environmental impact report will do exactly what you're asking for. So if somebody says to us, we would like to really look at a particular alternative, whether it's a reefing alternative or it's water desal or anything else, that has to go in as a primary comment as part of the original scoping as we start developing the alternatives. And then what the State Lands Commission and state agencies do in the context of that EIR is actually flesh out exactly what you asked, the technical feasibilities, the cost, and then if it is a viable alternative, you carry that through and you do the assessment of whether or not that proof of concept has legs. And then that would go to the commission. It's not, at that point, it's not a popularity contest because our staff, our experts on staff, we have biologists, we have engineers, we have all the others, and outside contractors that we would work with would be helping make recommendations on what alternatives are viable and which are not. And, I think that the most important part of that is that everything that comes down as the final sort of cafeteria approach of options that the commission will have in front of it will have gone through a very high level of review that the community will also have input on. So they can say, if there is somebody who's very knowledgeable about potential wind farming options, they can provide us with additional information and we can vet that. And we can work with other specialists outside of our immediate agency and continue to vet that. And so that is the process that will be happening when we do the EIR. So that when that starts, like I said, we're conservatively looking at kicking that off probably into fourth quarter next year. That's the very earliest. But that's because we want to get through the plug and abandonment phase. And what that means for all of you, like I said before, is that means no more oil comes out of the ground. When we're done with plug and abandonment, when we're done with a well, that we create a seal that means no oil to surface. And that's important because once that's all done, now this is no longer an oil production derrick or an oil production rig. It is a superstructure that's left that either comes out or gets repurposed. But again, that repurposing will be informed entirely based on science, economics, and everything else as part of the EIR.
So we have a question over here.
Hi. Touching
Name?
on the multitude of uses
name,
out
please?
there.
Your name?
My name is Daniel. I initially became interested in these platforms and RingCon a year ago exactly, pursuant to an interest in using them as battery swap-out platforms for electric aircraft that are being developed en masse, kind of quietly, but it's a lot easier to justify, extensive new low-flying helicopter traffic if it's offshore. And there are many, many options that a number of companies and a number of people in this room have seen. I know. I wonder, specifically speaking to the doctors, is this column of marine life capable of serving as a model for more naturalistic, sea life farms rather than the monocultures that, we've seen produce inferior stock oftentimes? Can we replicate this elsewhere for the environmental benefit and economic?
Someone want to take that question? I think the question basically is, can we learn something from this that can be replicated elsewhere in aquaculture? This is the way I would summarize that question.
I have no idea. I don't. I've never heard it phrased that way. That's very clever of you. So I do have a PhD, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to drivel at you and pretend I know something. So I don't know, but it's a really interesting concept.
1 second. No, we got to give some other people a chance. All right. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone's coming right now. And then we're going to take one over here next.
Hello, my name is Ian. I guess my central question is, who has their hands on the levers of power? Who are the most high up decision makers as it comes from the oil company, as it comes from the government, and how do we leverage in as a population?
Yeah, I mean, for our purposes on the platforms in state waters, it's going to be the State Lands Commission. It's going to be the controller, Betty Yee. It's going to be the Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis, and it's going to be the Director of Finance. Those are the people who are making decisions about what happens on state property. As it relates to federal property, that's going to be the Department of the Interior and BSEE. And BSEE is the Bureau of Safety Enforcement, or Environmental Enforcement, I'm sorry, but it's BSEE if you're looking it up online. But that's the federal equivalent for sort of what we do at state lands. And so they're the ones who make determinations about whether or not they're going to remove, and how they're going to do their maintenance and removal of the platforms. But I will put out there that I don't think any current oil and gas company, because I've talked with folks about this in the past, is willing to engage in a reefing option, because the current state of the law says that the companies have to be on the hook for forever for liability on the platforms. It's not something where there is a transition of interest. And so, the companies at that point are much more inclined to just remove everything and be done with it so that their liabilities are cut clear.
And who in the company is having that conversation?
I mean, that's going to be their board, right? For the major companies, that's going to be their board of directors. That's going to be their stakeholders in the context of public interests by way of stockholders and everything else like that. So it's across the board. I mean, when I say that, it's really going to be the entirety of the decision-making matrix for any of those companies. So, and since they're all publicly traded, again, that's going to all be their board.
Yeah, the other thing is that state law can be changed such that the oil companies don't have to accept liability forever. In theory, purely in theory, the state could accept liability, but current law prevents that.
Yeah, I think that's what one of the biggest issues with the law that California has, that law, the Marine Resources Legacy Act, and that's the biggest issue with enacting the law or utilizing it as we're starting to decommission things, is the liability in the CEQA.
I would also point out that Texas has had to address these same issues, and there is precedent for other states working out these long-term liability problems with oil companies after they've converted rigs to reefs.
Yeah, all the Gulf states, including Louisiana and stuff too. So yeah.
Alabama.
Yep.
This gentleman over here, yes, sir.
Wesley, I'd like to continue on with his. these rigs were towed. I think some of them were towed quite a distance, maybe from the Gulf of Mexico at one time, all the way and put up in the channel. So they've got to be towed somewhere. That's going to be it. Probably Bangladesh. Well, I like his idea. Why not let Bangladesh, if we have to get rid of them, give them to set up reefs off their coast.
Great comment. I don't think there's anybody who has a comment back on the panel, unless Milton, you seem like you want to talk about Bangladesh.
One of my favorite sunning spots. So the potential issue is that if you tow things across the Pacific that are covered in marine life, you're not guaranteed all the marine life is dead. And if you drop it in Bangladeshi waters, you could, in theory, spread California organisms, and you'd have an invasive species. And that's just something you have to consider if you want to do that.
I also think the age of these would be, as having been a director for many years of a public company, no one's going to want that liability.
Yeah, also, if you're towing something that long in the distance, once a barge gets a certain distance away from land, it can switch to something called bunker fuel, and bunker fuel makes the carbon footprint of any other type of fuel, like champagne. It's just the carbon footprint is insane. So I think that's another thing that you have to factor into making those choices.
Also add economics. Just the mobilization of the vessels that are necessary to do the decommissioning are anywhere between $30 and $70 million to get them out here to California. That's just to get the equipment here. When you're talking about a return trip under load, where you have thousands, tens of thousands of tons of steel and biomatter, assuming you could actually contain it, the return trip could probably be double, triple that. I mean, you could be looking at somewhere in the realm of $215 million just to drive it back, or to barge it back to any area, whether it's Bangladesh or anywhere significantly outside of the Pacific coast.
So before you get started, there's a thing in Bangladesh that we pioneered at the academy called halophytes, because 15% of Bangladesh is now underwater because of the incursion of the sea, because of climate change. And so halophytes are those plants that grow in salt water. And there's a whole proposal that I'm working on right now with Hazel Henderson, with Dennis Bushnell as the chief scientist at NASA, and we're working on a proposal for halophyte integration, which is a better way to help them grow food, and those halophytes also can be fish nurseries because you create artificial estuaries. Good.
My name is Bob Evans, and I don't want to disappoint everybody here tonight, but decommissioning is a big business today. I've been following the oil industry for a long time. And if people think that it's going to harm the oil companies, going to cost them a lot of money, one hand washes another hand. And the decommissioning companies are actually owned by the major oil companies. So they're business people, and they know how to move things around. So decommissioning, if people think it's going to be harming, the only thing it's going to be harming is that marine life below those platforms. And I have quite a bit of experience looking at that marine life. So that's just something to keep in mind, that the only thing that's going to be hurt, like Milton Love says, is that marine life, and we want to protect it as much as we can. Thank you.
So Bob has spent hundreds of hours as a scuba diver around these platforms and has got an unbelievable amount of footage about it, so he speaks with some information and knowledge. You're next. Ma'am.
Hello. I'm Isaac Hernandez. I actually made a film about Platform A from 50 years ago. And if you want to see it, I'm going to do a plug. It's called Better Together. Look it up. It's playing on Thursday and on Saturday in Santa Barbara. This is a rare chance to see it. But my question is, can we learn from the platforms to build some artificial reef that will serve the same purpose without the liability of them falling apart in 300 years? And because we have to think about the long term, right? And that without the danger for the fishermen. Is there something that we can learn so that we can build reefs that are safer and less liability?
By the way, they only deteriorate in 300 years if you don't maintain them. So I don't think anybody's proposing to let them rot. If they're going to be repurposed, they have to be repurposed. There's a cost and there's a benefit. So I'm not sure they'll fall down for that reason. But go ahead, please.
Well, that sounds like an engineering question. And I defer to Milton's answer of I'm not qualified to answer that.
I think also, though, oil companies invest in these structures because they withstand the test of time very well, and galvanized steel is one of the most durable materials that you can use to build something that you don't want to have to maintain for a long time. And so I don't know from the fishing perspective if we could find something that mimics fishing better than a reef without the hazard, but I know that you're not going to get much better than 300 years unmaintained.
Okay, over here, ma'am.
Is this on?
Yes.
My name is Sharon Rose. I'm on Goleta Sanitary Board, and we see in our equipment, our outfall pipe, a lot of aquatic life. When we do the diving every year, we hire someone to go down and check the pipe. So I know it's true that underground structures are attracting aquatic species. My question is more about toxicity. In my past life, I was working in health education and cancer prevention programs, and I was an environmental journalist. So I'm always thinking about toxicity and toxins. And Dr. Love, you did mention there's been a lot of studies, but you did mention something about barium and some other toxins down deep. And I just wondered if it seems to me like there would be a need for more studies to check the viability of the safety of some of these fish populations for human consumption.
Sure. I mean, this was a one-off, done in 1 year on a handful of species. So, yeah.
The barium, though, and the cadmium you referred to is the drill mud, which no longer would exist once either way, these are going to get shut down as oil wells. So the barium and the cadmium won't be existing after that. And it's not a persistent issue in the channel because the underwater current is strong enough. So I don't like the fact that they put it there in the first place, but it's not lingering around the platforms, if that's your concern.
There is one other thing I didn't mention, and that is the other thing that was analyzed was PAHs. PAHs are carcinogens that are breakdown products of hydrocarbons. And that's something that you might expect to see around platform organisms. And there were very low levels of PAHs except at fishes that lived at Holly, and that's probably because there's all those natural seeps. But I mean, your question's valid, sure.
I think there was another one that was done specifically on the shell mounds. So a lot of people have been studying what happens specifically inside the shell mounds, and I think what they've determined is that there could be toxicity within the shell mounds, but for the most part, it persists within the shell mounds, and it doesn't really seep into the environment surrounding the shell mounds and the actual marine environment on the platform. And so hypothetically, it just stays there, and then if you ever were to remove it, some of that toxicity would seep out and affect the surrounding area, but for now, it's just in the shell mounds.
So yeah, 2016 study by the Department of the Interior looked at 15 federal platforms off the shore of California and did various assays to determine whether or not there was toxicity on any of the shellfish that were down low. There was a negative finding. There have also been multiple studies done on what are called the 4H shell mounds, which were the location of the old 4H Chevron platforms offshore Carpinteria. And again, multiple corings and biological assays have been done to assess toxicity levels, and there's been nothing outside of a control, the control zones where there was nothing, so just standard issues. To what Claire said, the assessment on the shell mounds in Carpinteria have identified that there's a likelihood of old muds and cuttings under the shell hash, so it's sort of a large calcium carbonate shell over everything where the shells have actually sort of congealed, for lack of a better word. And so there is some thought to that, but the other side of that is that you'd also need to do an assessment of the half-life for a lot of the different toxins because a lot of those drilling muds and stuff are back from the early 50s, 60s. That was at a time when both the feds and the state allowed for drilling muds to be overboarded or just dropped off. That's not been allowed in state waters for decades. The federal waters, you can still do an NPDES permit, which is a point source permit for discharge on muds and water, produced water. But again, the muds are different than what they used to be.
Okay, we have a few more. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone, sir. Thank you, right there.
My name is Mike McCorkle. I'm a professional seafood harvester in Santa Barbara. I've been fishing around offshore oil wells since 1960. I've fished in federal waters, I've fished in state waters, fished all different kinds of gear, and pretty familiar with all the different rigs because I fish around them. And I'm just wondering, I think there's a group of people in this world that think that when platform Holly is removed, there won't be any more oil on the water. What's going to be the answer for you guys when they come and say, wait a minute, you didn't do a good job, you didn't cap those wells, you didn't do, how are you going to answer that?
So that's a good question. Part of the hydrocarbon seep study that we're looking at that I showed some video from is going to be very important. It's an educational outreach that the natural seeps in the Santa Barbara Channel are actually unlike virtually anywhere else in the world. Some of the most active, some of the most prolific, both for gas and for oil production. Coal Oil Point actually produces anywhere between 300 and 500 barrels of oil per day. That's about the same amount of oil that seeped out and hit the water in Refugio. This is a natural system. It has its own kind of rebound capabilities, and it's also a little different because when it's on the seafloor, it acts a little differently than when it sheens to the top. But when it gets to the top, what you see is a sheen around Holly a lot of times are the lighter ends of the hydrocarbons that are coming up, and you're seeing some of the like benzenes and things like that that are floating. So, you know, we're going to be engaging in a very active discourse with the community and everybody else about the fact that these seeps are, you know, these are geological, right? These have been around forever. This is actually part of the reason why a lot of the First Nations and Native Americans settled in this area, because these tars were used. They outcrop on the shores of Santa Barbara in various places. So we are prepared to have that talk. One of the things that we are working on is a collaborative study of seeps up and down California it was Senate Bill 44 by Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson, where we asked for funding to actually engage in some seep study work. We're doing that as we're also doing legacy well abandonment, so old wells that were abandoned prior to the 1938 to a very different standard. We're going back and re-abandoning where we know we have active leakers. If it's a man-made conduit, we'll plug it. If it's natural, we're not. You know, we're not going to blanket the seafloor in more tints. And I don't know if all of you are familiar, but outside of Holly, associated with an old ARCO program, were seep tints. These were used to try and collect the natural seep gas and you know, basically commoditize it for sale. That's not feasible. We're always open to new ideas, but natural seeps are natural seeps, and it's actually something that's very unique to the Santa Barbara Channel, and it's critical in its overall ecosystem. So we will just be talking with people about it, but we are not going to interact with the natural seeps. And the likelihood of folks seeing a little more activity over the next 20, 30 years is, I think, fairly high. One of the things that we've seen and we have data on is that when production was in full swing, those seeps that had some geologic relationship to the production reservoirs actually saw a net decline in overall seep activity. Again, this was something we were able to measure as a result of the seep tints and other things. So the likelihood is that once the oil production from the Santa Barbara Channel has ceased, those seeps will go back to their cyclic cycle that's more natural, that's based on whatever the hydrostatic pressures are that generate, you know, the emulsion of oil and gas coming to the surface. But it's going to be a reality, and it's not going to go away. This is a natural to the area.
One caveat, the oil, probably that's true. The seeps will go back to natural. Methane releases, which is the other one he's referring to, natural gas, is accelerating globally. It was first detected in the Santa Barbara Channel, and it's now been proven globally. And that seep is going to accelerate with climate change because it's directly a result of the heating of the ocean waters. So you're going to see way more natural gas coming up all over the world. You could see pictures in the Arctic Circle right now of a square kilometer where there's so much seepage, it looks like a fish feeding frenzy. There's so much gas coming to the surface. And that's because they have a 7-degree temperature differential between the two seasons. So there's a seepage issue that's huge beyond anything we're talking about tonight. It's the methane seepage, which is different from the oil. So he just said oil and gas. I'm only picking on the gas part.
Yeah, and it just has to do with the basic recharge of the previously produced reservoirs. But you're right. I mean, so what we're talking about is when you've got a straw and you're pulling out volume, you're taking out oil and gas from that reservoir, even if it's on a small scale. 35% of a total reservoir may be recoverable. When that stops, most of these reservoirs have different forms of regeneration, whether it's from the base rock material or whether it's an aquifer drive, so there's water pushing it, which it refills the void. And as it does that, it pushes that oil and gas that is present there. That doesn't get into the thermogenic sources of methane and everything else. These are just part of the reservoirs that are there. So.
Yes, sir.
Mark Chatillo, following up on this same point. Hopefully this is the last question, or we're about to wrap up because I need to get out of here with Seth. On this point of the seeps, how much do we know whether the connection is there between the gas company's La Goleta reservoirs that are deep underneath and whether there's any communication with the surface seeps in the South Elwood fields?
We don't have a direct connection. Nobody's done like an isotopic survey or tried to really figure that out at this point. What I can tell you is that the offshore reservoirs are unique in the sense that the geology for the Monterey Shale out there is so highly fractured that there is a lot of connectivity between some of the lower reservoirs to the surface. But that doesn't mean that you also don't have fully sealed reservoirs. And as you move onshore, you actually do find more of that. You find the more classic sort of pancake stacking of the lithosphere. And so you don't see that the same way offshore, where you'll actually have the classic kind of, like I said, pancake layer of geology. It's turned upside down and it rolls and it outcrops to the surface and then rolls back down. So the channel itself is pretty unique that way in terms of the way that the Monterey is fractured. And it's, that changes sort of the relationship between surface expressions and deeper reservoirs that may have some level of connectivity. So the answer is it depends.
So I want to thank everybody. I'm going to ask the panelists if they're willing to stick around and meet with you privately. If they will, great. If not, thanks so much, panelists. It's been really informative. It's a lot of information. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for caring enough to participate. Please have this conversation with your neighbors.